Our story today is found in the book of John, chapter 11, and we'll begin reading from verse 1. Now a man named Lazarus was sick. He was from Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. This Mary, whose brother Lazarus now lay sick, was the same one who poured perfume on the Lord and wiped his feet with her hair. So the sisters sent word to Jesus, "Lord, the one you love is sick." When he heard this, Jesus said, "This sickness will not end in death. No, it is for God's glory, so that God's Son may be glorified through it." Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So when he heard that Lazarus was sick, he stayed where he was 2 more days. And then he said to his disciples, "Let us go back to Judea." Our story opens with a statement. Now a man named Lazarus was sick. And if you and I know anything about Jesus' public ministry, we'll know that Jesus is no stranger to sickness. He is well acquainted with sick people and they with him, because hundreds and thousands of people from all over the land of Judea have, over the past 3 years, brought to Jesus their sick, their suffering, their disabled, their dying. And they did this because everybody knew that when you bring a sick person to Jesus, they won't leave sick. Everybody in Judea knew that Jesus was a healer. He welcomes great crowds to come to him and to be healed. Sometimes he goes to their houses. Sometimes they force their way through the roof of the venue where he's speaking. Sometimes they reach out to merely touch the corner of his robe and they are healed. Sometimes he's simply told about a sick person and he pronounces them healed from afar. Long-distance healing. Jesus has even healed lepers, that illness thought to be a curse from God, that illness known to be a certain death sentence. So if somebody in your family or your friend group or your congregation becomes sick, you take them to Jesus. Even some of the Roman military officers, enemies of the Jews, knew that. Because when someone you care about is sick, you'll do anything you can to get them help, won't you? And as has been witnessed far and wide in Judea, the power of God is on Jesus. Jesus does miracles, does the impossible. Jesus is a healer of sick people. And so it comes as no surprise to us that the sisters of Lazarus, upon seeing that he's sick, send a message to Jesus. So the sisters sent word to Jesus, "Lord, the one you love is sick." Now we've said that Jesus spends a lot of time surrounded by crowds, a sea of faces reaching out to him for help. But this time, the people reaching out to Jesus for help aren't just any old people, are they? They're not strangers in the crowd. These 3 siblings, Martha, Mary, and Lazarus, have a special relationship with Jesus. In fact, John, the author of this book, goes out of his way to make sure that we know and recall this fact. Verse 1, Now a man named Lazarus was sick. He was from Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. If we've read through the earlier chapters of John and other Gospels, Mary and Martha will be familiar characters to us. They've showed up before in other stories, in other interactions with Jesus. And it's as if John wants to drive the point of their relationship with Jesus home. He underlines in verse 2, This Mary, whose brother Lazarus now lay sick, was the same one who poured perfume on the Lord and wiped his feet with her hair. It's as if John is saying, yes, that Mary, you know, the one who poured expensive perfume on Jesus' feet during a dinner party in front of everyone, and washed his feet with her hair. Yes, that Martha, who criticized her sister for sitting at Jesus' feet and being taught like a man, instead of helping Martha prepare food in the kitchen. Yes, that Mary, that Martha. And just in case there was any doubt left in our minds about the special relationship Jesus has with Martha, Mary, and Lazarus, John then states it outright in verse 5. Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. Jesus has stayed at their house before. They have hosted him and his disciples before. Mary had several life-changing experiences with Jesus, who forgave her sins and turned her life around, and she became one of his disciples. And as for Lazarus, well, how is he identified? He is identified as the one whom Jesus loves. Verse 5 said that Jesus loved Martha and Mary and Lazarus, but in verse 3, the sisters send a message to Jesus saying, Lord, the one you love is sick. Now, if your family member is sick and you're sending for a healer, you don't want to be ambiguous or unclear. You want to tell the ambulance, the doctor, the precise address at which you want them to rush to. You want to tell them that this precise person is ill, come to this place quickly. But the fact that Lazarus' sisters need only identify their brother to Jesus as the one you love tells us of the special relationship existing between Jesus and Lazarus, and the fact that it was well known and understood. Now at this point we might say, doesn't Jesus love everyone? And in verse 5 it's stated that Jesus loved Mary and Martha too. Yes, Jesus did and does love every single person, every face in the crowd, every heart he sees and knows. So how then can we conclude that Jesus had a special connection or relationship with Lazarus in particular? For that, we look to the original language of the text. In English, we are limited to one word for love, which can be a bit confusing to non-English speakers when we use the same word to say that we love our spouse and to say we love pizza. But things are different in Greek. In Greek, we have at least 4 words for love, and each of these describe a different kind of love. Many of us might already be familiar with some of these: agape, eros, philia, and storge. Agape, for example, is often the word used to describe the love of God for humanity. This type of love is unconditional, selfless, not dependent on reciprocity. And then on the other hand, we have eros, for example, which refers to passionate, romantic, or sexual love. In verse 5, where it says, Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus, the Greek word used here is agape. Jesus loves them with the love that God loves all people, unconditionally, selflessly, a type of sacrificial love. But then in verse 3, Lord, the one you love is sick. The Greek word used here is philes, from philia. Now, the philia type of love is coined as the love of friendship, to regard with affection, to be fond of. It denotes a warmth often associated with close relationships, emotional bonds, and mutual respect, coming from the Greek root word philos, meaning friend or loved one. Now, John and Lazarus' sisters could have used storge to describe how Jesus loved Lazarus, which is more of a familial love, like that between family members, between parents and children, like Jesus seeing the siblings as family that he visits and stays at their house, an adopted family of his. But as we all know, one is not necessarily friends with family members. Friendship is a willing connection made mutually, a wanted attachment to a person that's not based on need or dependency. Friendship is two-sided, based on choice, shared respect, mutual trust, affection, and companionship. When describing Jesus' love for Lazarus, the word used is philia. Lazarus was Jesus' friend. While all the world was running after Jesus, and the sea of people chased after him, Jesus sought out Lazarus' company. He went to his house. Lazarus was someone he wanted to visit as a friend. We're not told how this friendship began, but John wants to make it abundantly clear Lazarus was someone special to Jesus. He was his friend. Now we've seen how Jesus spends his days healing the crowds of people who are enemies, strangers, foreigners. So how do we anticipate that Jesus will react when not just anyone, but his friend is sick? Well, we expect that he'll go to him immediately, that his actions will be spurred by a particular urgency, a haste. When you get the call that your friend, whom you love, is in hospital, you drop everything. You don't walk, you run. And so what does Jesus do? Verse 6. So when he heard that Lazarus was sick, he stayed where he was 2 more days. Why on earth would Jesus do that? Why would Jesus delay going to his sick friend for 2 whole days? We're not told. We're only told that 2 days later, Jesus tells his disciples, "Let us go back to Judea." Bethany, the village of Lazarus, is in Judea, and so we might presume that at long last, after 2 days of delaying, Jesus is finally going to his friend. But it is at this point that his disciples have something to say about that. Verse 8. But Rabbi, they said, a short while ago the Jews there tried to stone you, and yet you are going back? Jesus answered, Are there not 12 hours of daylight? Anyone who walks in the daytime will not stumble, for they see by the world's light. It is when a person walks at night that they stumble, for they have no light. After he had said this, he went on to tell them, Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I am going there to wake him up. His disciples replied, Lord, if he sleeps, he will get better. Jesus had been speaking of his death, but his disciples thought he meant natural sleep. So then he told them plainly, Lazarus is dead, and for your sake I am glad I was not there, so that you may believe. But let us go to him. Then Thomas, also known as Didymus, said to the rest of the disciples, Let us also go, that we may die with him. Now what is going on here? Why are the disciples loath for Jesus to return to the region of Judea? Why do they not wish for him to return? They say why in verse 8, But Rabbi, a short while ago the Jews there tried to stone you, and yet you are going back? The Jews in Judea had tried to murder Jesus. This is recorded in the chapter before, in John 10. During Hanukkah and the Hanukkah festival celebration in Jerusalem, the Jews listening to Jesus speak there pick up stones to stone him to death. Jesus' life is in danger in Jerusalem and Judea. There are many who wish to kill him there. This is the reason the disciples are pushing for him to stay away. They are concerned for his safety. But Jesus in response insists that he is going back to Judea, and the disciples' expectation of what that will mean is confirmed by the words of Thomas in verse 16. Then Thomas said to the rest of the disciples, Let us also go, that we may die with him." They expect him to be killed, and Thomas tells the others, "Well, let's go die with him." Could this be the reason for Jesus' delay? Could this be why Jesus waited 2 whole days to go to Lazarus? Was he hesitant to put himself in danger? Let us continue. On his arrival, Jesus found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Now Bethany was less than 2 miles, that is about 3 kilometers, from Jerusalem, and many Jews had come to Martha and Mary to comfort them in the loss of their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him, but Mary stayed at home. The first thing to notice is the proximity of Jerusalem. No wonder the disciples were concerned about Jesus traveling to Bethany. It's just down the road from the capital city. And now the house of Martha and Mary and Lazarus is filled with people, filled with mourners and supporters who've come from Jerusalem. In Jewish mourning customs, those grieving would often remain seated in their house, while the comforters come to them. Are any of the Jews, now in the house of the sisters, among those who picked up stones to kill Jesus in the previous chapter? The second detail to notice is the mention of how many days Lazarus has been in the tomb. His body, we're told, has been there for 4 days. Why mention this? Well, in ancient Jewish thought, there was a belief that the soul of a person lingered near the body for 3 days after death, hoping to return to it. This has no basis in Scripture, but it was nonetheless a superstition that existed at the time. So why would it be significant that Lazarus has been in the tomb, dead, for 4 days? Well, because by the 4th day, any hope of Lazarus somehow returning to life would be lost from everyone's minds. By the 3rd day, decay had set in. In that climate, a dead body will be decaying in earnest by the 3rd day, meaning by the 4th day, all hope of return is gone. Culturally, the person would be considered truly and irreversibly dead. And now we arrive at the 3rd notable detail. Martha goes out to meet Jesus on the way, while Mary stays at home. At first glance, this behavior seems uncharacteristic, almost an inversion of the behavior we're used to seeing from these 2 sisters. Martha is characterized as being active, the practical one, while Mary seems contemplative and emotionally expressive. But more than that, Mary is known as a person who can't be kept away from Jesus. She interrupts dinner parties to approach him, gets close, she can't be dragged into the kitchen, and prepare food for their guests like a woman was expected to do at the time. No, she will instead be found sitting by Jesus' feet and being taught by him the way only a male student would be taught by a rabbi. Meanwhile, Martha, in other accounts, sticks to her duties. She, likely as the eldest sister, is keenly aware of the expectations and the role that others demand that she play, which with a house full of guests would be host, cook, accommodator. But now what do the sisters do? Mary doesn't go to Jesus, she stays at home, and Martha doesn't stay at home in the kitchen to serve and host, she leaves and goes to Jesus. Why do each of the sisters do what they do? We might at first think that Mary might be too sick, weak, or in shock from the grief to move. We might even wonder whether Mary is struggling with disappointment and anger over Jesus delaying and allowing their brother to die. He whom she knows is capable of healing and miracles, Perhaps she doesn't want to, or is struggling to make herself see him, we might ask. But it is another reason that reveals itself in the following verses that tells us why Martha goes and Mary stays. So Martha leaves the house, goes out alone, and meets Jesus on the road. And when she meets him, this is what takes place. "Lord," Martha said to Jesus, "if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask." Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise again." Martha answered, "I know he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day." Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live, even though they die, and whoever lives by believing in me will never die. Do you believe this?" "Yes, Lord," she replied. "I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, who is come into the world." And after this interaction, we read in verse 28, "After she, that is Martha, had said this, she went back and called her sister Mary aside. 'The teacher is here,' she said, 'and is asking for you.' When Mary heard this, she got up quickly and went to him. Now Jesus had not yet entered the village, but was still at the place where Martha had met him. When the Jews who had been with Mary in the house, comforting her, noticed how quickly she got up and went out, they followed her, supposing she was going to the tomb to mourn there. When Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. "Where have you laid him?" he asked. "Come and see, Lord," they replied. Jesus wept. Then the Jews said, "See how he loved him." But some of them said, "Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying?" So after Martha has this conversation with Jesus, she goes back to the house and tells Mary that the teacher is here and is asking for her. And at hearing this, we're told Mary gets up. She doesn't only get up, she gets up quickly to go meet Jesus. In fact, she gets up so abruptly that all the visitors in the house notice it. And in response, they follow her, assuming she's going to the tomb to mourn. And it is perhaps now that we begin to see why Martha may have gone to see Jesus alone, first, without telling her sister. Because as we've established before, Martha and Mary are two very different people. Where Martha is typically practical, down to earth, and pushing through situations with action, Mary is more outwardly expressive of her feelings. She is a feeler. She exists in emotions deeply and in some ways wears her heart on her sleeve. If Martha had told Mary that Jesus is coming, as soon as Martha knew it, Mary would have done what she does here in verse 29, get up quickly and go to him. Remember, nothing can keep Mary from being close to Jesus. And Mary, unlike Martha, doesn't always do things in the most subtle or unnoticeable of ways. She expresses, she emotes, she has made big gestures. She almost doesn't seem to care how she looks or who's watching if Jesus is around. Not a bad characteristic. But it does mean that Mary being told Jesus is near and subtly excusing herself or leaving unnoticed will be unlikely. And her sister knows this. This understanding is backed up by how Martha does eventually tell Mary. She doesn't announce it to everyone to hear. She pulls Mary aside to tell her Jesus is coming. Even now, she is attempting a more private or subtle exit. But Mary's personality isn't muted, isn't subdued, and she's not conservative with her feelings. She gets up and dramatically leaves, of course catching the attention of everyone, so they go with her. And this, as we said, gives us an insight into why Martha likely went to Jesus alone first. Because she knew that once Mary knows Jesus is here, she will make a dramatic exit and likely run to Jesus and likely be followed by many or all in the house. Meaning, Martha would not have the opportunity for a quiet, private conversation with Jesus. That is likely why Martha goes alone first. Martha, in her grief, needs something. She needs to see Jesus. She needs to talk to him. She needs a private, sincere, unrushed word. And she needs a setting to do this in, which is away from the bustle and the busyness of their house, away from an audience. She is looking for a frank and direct face-to-face with Jesus in her grief. Now, we're going to contrast the interaction which each of the sisters has with Jesus, because their interactions with him are starkly different. And John, the author, highlights this to us by having the sisters begin their conversation with Jesus in the same way, but then diverge dramatically, highlighting the diversion by beginning on the same note. Lord, Martha said to Jesus, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Mary said, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. The two mourning sisters begin on the same thought. Jesus, if you had been here, Lazarus would not be dead. And by saying this, the unspoken question hangs in the air. Why were you not here? Why did you not get here in time? Why did you not heal Lazarus, you, the healer of the sick? And then Jesus' interaction with each sister forks, deviates dramatically. Because when meeting Martha, what does the conversation look like? Well, it's a theological conversation. Martha immediately engages Jesus in a theological dialogue about resurrection. Jesus said to her, your brother will rise again. Martha answered, I know he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day. Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live even though they die, and whoever lives by believing in me will never die. Do you believe this? Yes, Lord, she replied. I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, who is come into the world. Now let's contrast this with Jesus' meeting with Mary. When Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. Where have you laid him? He asked. Come and see, Lord, they replied. Jesus wept. Martha, in her sorrow, is looking for theological answers. That's where she is. She's looking for Jesus to explain, to tell her a plan, to recalibrate her vision or theological understanding so that she can work through the grief and see clearly what to hope for and base her foundation on. Jesus' response is to do that. He meets her on her terms. He talks about the future resurrection. But then Jesus does a second step. First, he meets her where she is, but then he adds something. He shifts the conversation from being merely hope of a far future resurrection to bringing her theological eyes to focusing on him in the present. Martha talks about the future day of resurrection. Jesus says, I am the resurrection and the life. Martha, you are finding your comfort in this future event, and that is not wrong. But the resurrection and the life is standing in front of you. Your comfort in your grief is not far off. It is near. It is me. It is talking to you. To be able to hold on in the darkness of your grief, you can keep your eyes fixed on me. So Jesus meets Martha where she is in a theological conversation, and then he pulls it from being theological theory, distant and future, into the now, into something very real and present. And he invites Martha to step from where she is into that real and present anchoring. Do you believe this? He says. Yes, Lord, she replied. I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, who has come into the world. In this short interaction, Jesus has helped Martha to crystallize her theology and to bring her comfort of resurrection from distant and far to being very close to her. And she responds by accepting that comfort, the belief that Jesus is life himself, and he is very, very close. This is the way Jesus journeys with Martha in her grief. That is what steadies and comforts Martha. But now we turn our attention to Mary's interaction with Jesus. Because Mary, in contrast, when seeing Jesus, doesn't delve into theology. She collapses in tears at his feet. She is wrecked and loudly hurting, letting her feelings flow out, even in front of all those people watching. The way she expresses her grief is outward, visceral, filled with visible emotion. And where Martha added a declaration of faith, but I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask, Mary adds no such statement. Where she is in her grief, she is not in the place where she can make declarative, faith-filled, steadying statements. Mary is in a tumultuous storm of feelings. She feels them keenly. Now, we've seen how Jesus engaged with Martha in the manner in which she approached him, that theological dialogue about resurrection. Now, Jesus engages with Mary very differently. It's like he switches gears and meets Mary in her grief completely differently. He doesn't talk about the theology of resurrection with the sobbing woman on the ground in front of him. When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. "Where have you laid him?" he asked. "Come and see, Lord," they replied. Jesus wept. Jesus meets Mary emotionally, speaking and existing in her language. He allows himself to be moved by what she is feeling. He is moved by the emotions rolling through the crowd. Right now, he isn't explaining. He isn't asking if she believes. He isn't reminding them all of a future resurrection. Right now, he cries with her and with the crowd. Mary needs Jesus to meet her where she is in her grief, and he does, just like he did with Martha. But then, if we remember, Jesus met Martha's theological conversation, but then he added something. He added relationship and her focus on and trust in him personally and presently. Now Jesus does the same thing with Mary. He meets her empathetically, compassionately in her emotional outpouring and expression, but then he also adds something. Because he could stay all day next to Mary as she sobs on the ground. But as he cries with her, he also asks, "Where have you laid him?" Jesus is moving the narrative, the plot forward. Even in their grief, even in his grief, he is saying to Mary, "I'm with you in the present pain, and now I'm also going to do something." He both meets Mary in her feelings and also adds action. Let's go to the tomb. Show me where he is. Martha looked for theological answers. Jesus gave her that, but he added relationship. Mary looked for sharing her emotions. Jesus gave her that, but he added action. Verse 34, "Where have you laid him?" he asked. "Come and see, Lord," they replied. Jesus wept. Then the Jews said, "See how he loved him." But some of them said, "Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying?" Jesus, once more deeply moved, came to the tomb. It was a cave with a stone laid across the entrance. "Take away the stone," he said. "But Lord," said Martha, the sister of the dead man, "by this time there is a bad odor, for he has been there 4 days." Then Jesus said, "Did I not tell you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God?" Again, we have the reality of a rotting body. Martha, who is her practical self, is loath for all of them to be inflicted with the smell that will hit them once the stone in front of the tomb is rolled away. But Jesus, just as he is undaunted by being around the sick, undaunted by touching unclean lepers, seems undaunted by the stench of death. And he reminds Martha, roots Martha in their earlier conversation. "Martha, don't you remember? If you believe, you will see the glory of God. Trust me, Martha." So they took away the stone. Then Jesus looked up and said, "Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I said this for the benefit of the people standing here, that they may believe that you sent me." When he had said this, Jesus called in a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out." The dead man came out, his hands and feet wrapped with strips of linen and a cloth around his face. Jesus said to them, "Take off the grave clothes and let him go." We can only imagine the explosion of emotion, relief, utter amazement that washed over Lazarus' 2 sisters as they rush forward to unbind their brother from his burial clothes. Lazarus comes back from the dead, is raised back to life. And his experience, this story from his perspective, is that the first thing he knew, the first thing he heard, was the voice of his friend, was the voice of Jesus calling him, telling him to come out. The first theme word of this chapter, of this story, is the word why. The chapter is full of this question. It's hanging on every corner. It is the backdrop of every interaction. And that is not done by accident or chance, because why just so happens to be the main thought, the main question that arises with grief. Why is the companion word of death? Why is the response to loss? Why is the veil at funerals, the ache in hospitals, the prayer of mourners? Why is the natural human response posed to God when people experience grief? The confusion, the not seeing the point, faced with the despair and pointlessness of death. And John 11, in telling a story about death and grief, centers this question. And this why question that everyone's asking is all directed at Jesus. Throughout the story, people are asking why Jesus is doing the things he's doing. Why comes from the disciples. Why are you going to Judea? Why comes from the sisters. Why did you let Lazarus die? Why did you delay? Why comes from the crowd and from us as the hearers of this story. At almost every turn, Jesus seems to be acting in a way that moves one or all of us to ask, why? It's as though John is inviting us as readers, as listeners, to join in that greater funeral chorus of why, the song that grief and loss-stricken people ask every day. But here is the brilliant aspect of John 11. Throughout, we are shown why people think Jesus is doing something, and then it is revealed why he's actually doing something. Often the assumption of Jesus' whys are wrong. At the very start, he delays going to Lazarus for 2 days. We and others might think Jesus' delay is because he's protecting himself and is loath to travel to where his life might be in danger. But Jesus has already told us the real reason back in verse 4. No, it is for God's glory, so that God's Son may be glorified through it. Things are playing out in a certain way in order to glorify God and his Son. Then Jesus says, our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I am going there to wake him up. His disciples wonder why. They think this means Lazarus is literally sleeping and will get better. So why, Jesus, are you going to interrupt his sleep? Jesus says, no, Lazarus is dead. And for your sake I am glad I was not there, so that you may believe. Again, Jesus' whys are not what people think his whys are. He repeats that this is playing out in the way it's playing out, so that his disciples and everyone else watching may come to trust in Jesus, in his resurrection, in his plan, in his power to raise the dead and rise from the dead. Again, when Jesus says to Martha that her brother will rise again, she thinks the reason he's saying this is to refer to the future day of resurrection. But Jesus is talking about now. Mary gets up quickly to see Jesus. The crowd assumes she's going to the tomb to mourn. The crowd continues to likely think that Jesus is wanting to go to the tomb to mourn with Mary. But Jesus' whys are not our whys. He's going there to raise Lazarus. Martha continues to question Jesus' whys. Why are you wanting, Lord, to roll away the stone? The odor. Why are we getting close to death? The theme word of John 11 is why. And it is this same word that is echoed when we are touched by death, when we experience loss and grief. Why, God? Why did you let this happen? Why, even after we prayed, after we fasted, after we believed, after we claimed your promises, why is this happening? Why her? Why him? Why so young? Why us? Why your silence? Why your delay? Why your absence? John 11 meets mourners where they are. This question, like Jesus meeting mourners on the road, meets grief-stricken people on their road of suffering. And now, at the heart of all the whys that populate this narrative, we find verse 35. Jesus wept. This is the shortest verse in the Bible. It is much quoted and well known, frequently studied and talked about. And centered around this verse is an irony. That irony is that the ongoing misunderstanding of Jesus' whys throughout the chapter doesn't remain dormant or locked away in the pages of this story. It actually continues in the form of the interpretation of verse 35, or rather, the misinterpretation. The misinterpretation of why Jesus wept. Why does Jesus weep in verse 35? Scholars and theologians have discussed this for years. I have heard plenty of sermons on this. There's a host of theories as to why Jesus cries here. A very common interpretation is that Jesus was crying for himself. That all of this taking place just 1 week before Jesus' crucifixion, that Lazarus' death is shadowing the cross, and that Jesus weeps in anticipation of his own suffering and death. But remember, if there's anything we've learned from this story, it should be that Jesus' whys are not always what we think they are. And the entire rest of the chapter doesn't in any way back up this theory that Jesus was crying for himself. The answer to why Jesus wept is actually answered by the second theme of John 11. Jesus meets our grief. Jesus' actions in John 11 is a masterclass in meeting grief and those touched by death. Because as we know from this story, and as we know from our own life experiences, grief and loss touches people differently. Grief looks differently on different people. We've already seen this exemplified in Martha and Mary, the theological dialogue versus the outpour of pure emotion. Two sisters who lost the same brother, but needed different things in their grief. Not only that, but grief is experienced by the same person in different stages too. We talk about the 5 stages of grief, which sounds like a neat little mini course that you go through and then graduate from, but that's not how it works. This can wrongly conjure up in our minds an image of an orderly transit from one stage to the next. But of course, there are more than 5 stages, and they don't always arrive in chronological order. They're all jumbled up and in a mess. And it's possible to jump from numbness to anger to acceptance and then back again into anger within the span of a single minute in a day. And grief, you don't graduate from grief. It doesn't end or go away. No two grieving people are the same. They need very different approaches and very different kinds of support. So how on earth, if John is telling us a story of how Jesus meets grieving people, is he supposed to encapsulate all those different types of mourners and all those different experiences? Well, this is the genius and the utter largeness of Jesus' love. It is personalized, tailored, and dynamic. Throughout John 11, Jesus is meeting with the plethora of stages, emotions, and needs of grief-stricken people. His gear shift between talking to Martha and talking to Mary isn't just some interesting detail in the text. It points us to the heart of Jesus himself, which is that Jesus meets people where they are, dynamically, in grief and in everything else. His very coming to earth was all about that, meeting people where they are, not where they're supposed to be, not where the textbook on grief says they should be, not where the church members expect they should be. Jesus comes in flesh and blood, stepping into human beings' context, coming into their homes, their villages, their culture, entering in every possible way into their lives. And he does this with grief too. In John 11, he meets the confusion on the road, the person who needs theological answers. He meets the one who needs to simply be sat with and wept together with. Jesus knows that some mourners need to be met in private, quiet, thoughtful, contemplative settings and ways. He knows that some need answers. He knows that others need to be surrounded by friends and family, that some need the space to explode their feelings without restraint or shame, and to have that emotional outpouring mirrored and joined, and he meets them there. But this is where people often get confused and hung up. Jesus knows. He knows that he's going to go resurrect Lazarus. He knows. He says so before he even gets to Bethany. He says so in verse 4, verse 11, verse 15, verse 23, and verse 40. He repeats it again and again to his disciples, to Martha and Mary. I am going to raise Lazarus from the dead. I am on my way to resurrect him. No, not in the distant future. I'm doing it now. If Jesus knew that he was going to raise Lazarus on that very day, why is he meeting Martha and Mary on the road? Why is he having this theological conversation with Martha? Why is he weeping with Mary? He knows that in a few minutes all their grief will be gone. He's literally the resurrection and life personified. If resurrection himself is on the way to raise the dead, why is he weeping on the road? He could just lift Mary up and say, "Stop crying. There's no need for tears. In a moment you'll have your brother back. In a moment death will not be your reality anymore." But Jesus doesn't tell her to stop. No, he joins her. And this right here is why so many misinterpret Jesus as weeping for himself. Because it doesn't compute for them, it doesn't make sense to them that Jesus is weeping and mourning over Lazarus if he's just going to raise him up in the next moment. But we think this way because we often fail to do what Jesus does. We fail to empathize. We fail to meet people in their grief, and instead rush them on into the parts we feel comfortable with, the conclusions, the faith-affirming place. As believers, and this is particularly symptomatic of the global West, we like much more to jump to the tidy parts. We jump to platitudes. Yes, it's very sad that you lost your husband, but you'll see him soon. We jump to theological theory. Do not mourn as the pagans mourn, for we have a future hope of the resurrection. Death, where is your sting? We jump to the neatly packaged presentations. When we all get together in heaven, what a day of rejoicing that will be. Sermons at funerals are mostly centered around resurrection, the future hope, the power Jesus has over the grave. Many say things like, "This funeral isn't a day of sadness, it's more a celebration of their life." It's not forbidden for someone to approach their grief in this manner, but if everyone mourns differently and needs to be met differently, and nearly all funerals and condolences look a certain way, then we can safely say that our approach to people in grief is not meeting them where they are. It is having a one-size-fits-all model and forcing it onto every death, every funeral, every tragedy, every mourner. And people who've experienced loss, whether it is the loss of a life or the loss of something else, often don't need that. Not really. We might feel impatient at this point and say, well, we do have this hope. We do believe in the resurrection. We do believe that death is not permanent to those we love, and that Jesus will raise them again soon. So why should we collapse on the road and sob into the dirt? That would be like pretending we don't have this hope, that our dead being raised up to life is just around the corner. But this sort of thinking stems not from a place of faith, but usually from a place of fear. fear of our own feelings, fear of being honest about them, fear of the discomfort of others' emotions. And now consider this. That's how it always is for God. He always sees resurrection as just around the corner. It's just a moment away for him. He sees all those grieving on earth, and he knows that in just a little while, all that sorrow and loss will be done. He will extinguish their pain in a moment. Jesus was literally on the way to raising Lazarus back to life. But this is where Jesus differs from us. He meets people where they are. How easy it would be for the infinite God who exists in eternity to shrug at our grief, which to him could seem like a meaningless speck, a moment, a drop in the ocean of eternity. Insignificant, inconsequential, how easy it would be to meet humanity and their suffering in this way. But Jesus is compassion. He is empathy and the God who is close. Although he's on the way to raise Lazarus, he meets Martha and Mary's grief on the way to do so. Not just meets, but affirms and values. Not just affirms and values, but joins. He joins in their grief. He joins in their theological questions. He joins in their tears. The text says he was deeply moved and his spirit troubled when he sees Mary crying and the crowd weeping. How, we might ask, can it trouble him if he's on the way to fix the problem? But that is who he is. That is love. And a magic happens when love is expressed, when he does this. Verse 35, Jesus wept. Then the Jews said, "See how he loved him." Jesus joining in and expressing mourning translated to witnesses as love. In his weeping, they saw his love. John told us that Jesus loved Martha, Mary, and Lazarus. Martha and Mary know and state that Jesus loved Lazarus. But it is when Jesus joins Mary in her tears, weeps with her, that many of those who are watching conclude, "See how he loved him." This is the power of empathy, compassion, and meeting people where they are. It communicates love. Jesus shows us that he loves us deeply. To love someone is to be present with them, to laugh with those who laugh, and mourn with those who mourn. This is a masterclass for us in how to approach and meet people who are grieving and suffering in a pain-stricken world. And not one size fits all, not a lecture on keeping your chin up, but a meeting, a joining. And of course, Jesus doesn't stop there. As we've said, he doesn't remain weeping with Mary for months. He weeps with her and then goes and resurrects Lazarus. Jesus does both, sits with the mourner, and then restores life and joy. Because just like others in the crowd, some people do go, yes, that's lovely that Jesus feels and cries and all, but he's able to do miracles. Why couldn't he stop Lazarus from dying? And in reply to that question, Jesus goes and raises the dead man. For the glory of God, for the sake of growing their trust in him, for the sake of all those watching, Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me. But I said this for the benefit of the people standing here, that they may believe that you sent me. But again, many are lost and confused as to why Jesus would stop on the way to resurrect and mourn with the grieved. Jesus wasn't weeping for himself. The text clearly says that he takes in, watches, lets the sorrow of Mary and the crowd touch him, move him deeply. Jesus didn't make this situation about him. Jesus is all about other people and meeting them where they are. And that should be our guide, our example for how we sit with and meet with and support those grieving and in distress around us. Don't make it about you, make it about them. Meet them where they are. Because when we do this, we live out love. People recognize that love. Just like it caused many in the crowd to witness Jesus' tears and conclude, oh, he truly loved him. Finally, we will end with what Jesus said at the beginning. The sister sent word to Jesus, Lord, the one you love is sick. When he heard this, Jesus said, this sickness will not end in death. Even now, there are those among us who know people who are sick. There are those who know someone who is old, someone who is dying. There are those who have someone in hospital or who are fighting with illness or the threat of death themselves. People who every day are praying desperately to Jesus, the one well acquainted with sickness, the healer, and begging him to do something, to come quickly, to heal their mother, their brother, their friend, themselves. We talk about resurrection and empty tombs, especially around Easter and at funerals. We talk about how Jesus is the life and the resurrection, how in him death has met its match. But the truth is, we are surrounded by death. We are a planet decaying and dying. We are drowning in loss. We have grief and death on every side. Much of the time, honestly, it doesn't feel like death has been defeated. Death, where is your sting? Well, it's right here. In my heart, in my mouth, in my back like a dagger. Like Mary and Martha, we cry out in pain and ask our agonizing questions. In response, Jesus is doing for us what he did in John 11. He does a dual thing, two things at the same time. First, he is present and engages with every step of death. The pre-fear, the crushing loss, the mourning stage, the what now part, the after death. He meets people where they are at every step in mourning. And hanging over everything like a great canopy is his promise. This sickness will not end in death. At first glance, to the disciples, that may have looked like a mistake. Well, Jesus' Lazarus' sickness did end in death. Well, Jesus, my loved one's illness did end in death. But that was not the end. Death is not the end. Lazarus' sickness didn't end in death. That was the middle part, the second act. Lazarus' sickness ended in resurrection, in reunion, joy, and life. That is the promise for everyone touched by death, all who are grieving. All of this will not end in death. Your losses, the loss of friendships, the loss of innocence, the loss of yourself, the loss of hope, it won't end there. Jesus is a God who is on his way to resurrect our dead. Jesus, as we speak, is on the long road to bring us back our loved ones and all we've been robbed of. But in the meantime, and it can be a very mean time, Jesus makes sure that we're not alone or abandoned. Jesus is the God who weeps. Jesus has promised he will meet you and be with you at every step of the road, on his way to resurrect what you have lost.